We'll start shortly. So maybe those who who don't have a seat yet. So there's still 3, 4, 5 in the front, and one of my colleagues is kind enough to put more seats out there in the back. It's good to see that there's still plenty of interest in arms control and disarmament. I'm very happy about that. And don't be shy, the spots on the first row actually are the best ones. So good, okay. So then let me welcome you to today's roundtable discussion, which is entitled After the Summit of the Future, New Momentum for Arms Control and Disarmament? Question mark. It's really something that we should discuss. We are organizing this together with the Austrian Research Association, there with the Working Group on Peaceful Change that I'm heading, and with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. And I would like to thank Rebecca, who is on Zoom. You're going to see her in a second, for helping us organize this event in really wonderful fashion. And thanks a lot to everyone actually who is here in the room as well and helps to facilitate things here. A few things, a few words about the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future. Yeah? It's a really long document, if I remember correctly. It's almost 61 pages long. And contains the Pact for the Future proper, and then 2 annexes. The one is Annex 1 is on the Global Digital Compact, and Annex 2 on the Declaration on Future Generations. And this is not only a long and perhaps sometimes a bit unwieldy document, but it's something that has been in the making for a long time now. And so for over a year, there were lots and lots of discussions, multiple stakeholders and everything. So there was a lot of input into this process, and then eventually it was negotiated at the United Nations a few weeks ago. When we look at the Pact for the Future, and this is actually where we find most of the things on arms control and disarmament, then there are 5 different sections. There is no section on disarmament and arms control, but there is a section on international peace and security. And within that section, there are 2 actions. So those are supposed to be the action points that summarize the gist of it and that should galvanize support by the member states. There's action number 25, who would advance the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. And there's action 26, who will uphold our disarmament obligations and commitments. And then when you look at the pact itself proper, then you're going to find much more elaboration on all of these things. Especially on different kinds of weaponry, different kinds of disarmament obligations, and so on. A couple of things are also implicit. So Action 27, for instance, talks about new and emerging technologies, and obviously these oftentimes can be weaponized. They have repercussions for arms control and disarmament. But I'm going to stop here. It's really just to introduce. And I think events like this are important because this is a big document. And now the point is to fill that document with life. Yeah? So that doesn't stay something that was simply negotiated at the United Nations, but that it's actually something that changes things. I'm hesitating about it being implemented because it's not legally binding or something like that. But we're going to get at that. Let me introduce you our panelists quickly. And now I think you should be able to see Rebecca. There she is. Rebecca, hello. Rebecca, if I'm not mistaken, is in New York again at the moment. She is the chief of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs here in Vienna. And given that job, she obviously shuttles back a lot between Vienna and New York. She's been at UNODA since 2019, and since 2022 she is the chief. She's been at the United Nations since 2008, so for about the same time that I've been at this institution. And she previously served in the in the United States Department of State in Washington. Then to my right is Jaewoo Shin. He is senior analyst at the Open Nuclear Network, which is associated with Pax Sapiens, and he specializes on the analysis of nuclear and missile programs. He's basically one of my neighbors here from the Argentinierstraße. And the other neighbor is really quite amazing. The other neighbor is Stephanie Fenkart from across the street, actually, quite literally. She is the director of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. She has been in this position since 2016. Also has a number of other positions. She is member of the Advisory Committee for Strategy and Security Policy of the Scientific Commission at the Austrian Armed Forces. It's a very long name.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
And she's also the chair of the board of the Balkan Forum in Pristina. And then we also have someone who has actually been at the Summit of the Future himself. That is Markus Wainde Wane. He was there as UN Youth Delegate of Austria, and has a lot of other interests in international affairs as well. Experience in development initiatives in Senegal, has a background in business, economics, and international legal studies. So plenty of interest in international affairs. And I suggest that to our panelists that maybe starting with Rebecca, something like 5 minutes or so, dealing with our question mark. So the UN Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, is that likely to provide new momentum for disarmament and/or arms control? And if so, how could this happen? Because it probably wouldn't happen just by itself. Rebecca, then the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Markus, and I hope everybody can hear me well. Hi from New York. It's great to be with you, sadly not in person, but really excited to be doing this jointly again with the Diplomatic Academy and the Austrian Research Association. So thank you so much to both of the partners involved in this event. It's the second time I think we're joining forces this year. And as you said, Markus, I think it's a very timely moment to be speaking about this pact for the future and what it might mean for arms control and disarmament. And for me, I mean, I think it's really worth reflecting for a moment on the pact as a whole. I mean, you honed in on the security dimensions, and that's really what we're here to talk about today, specifically disarmament, arms control. But as a whole, I think it really is worth emphasizing that this is a really unique moment in history. I think the SG has called it a once-in-a-generation moment where 193 member states came together to agree this document. And to really give kind of fresh impetus to multilateralism writ large. So we'll talk about, disarmament specifically, but this was really the idea behind the summit as a whole. And as you said, Markus, a lot of buildup over multiple years to get to this point. And of course, very difficult and long negotiations, including on many disarmament-related aspects. So I think that is also a reflection of our time, and we need to recognize that. But the fact that we have this pact now, we have disarmament commitments, actions that are quite concrete, and you mentioned a couple of them, but I'll say maybe a word about a couple of others that you also didn't mention. I mean that, and then that disarmament is really in there as a critical and recognized as a critical security instrument. I think that's really worth emphasizing. And also, as you mentioned, a very kind of intensive and long participatory preparation process. I mean, obviously, it's ultimately states who have adopted this document. It was states negotiating the content thereof, but lots of inputs from different actors in the lead up, from regional organizations, from civil society, from youth, and I know we'll hear more from the other Markus about the youth dimension. I think there's a question mark in the title for a reason. I mean, we shouldn't be naive about, now we have this pact and to think that this is the end point. It's very much a starting point. So I think there are many elements that will be important and very hopefully very helpful as we move forward with different disarmament related processes, but it is by no means a solution. As you said, Markus, it's not a legally binding document. It's a set of actions and commitments that states have outlined, and it's now about what do we, collectively do to take that forward. So just to maybe highlight a couple of things that are related and I think particularly important for the disarmament arms control discussion, and we can elaborate more in the more interactive component. But I mean, you mentioned the one action that speaks about a nuclear weapon-free world, Markus, and I think this one is really, really important. And I'll be very curious to hear Jaewoo's assessment in particular of this one. But it's also the one that I think on disarmament issues attracted the most attention, was also one of the most contentious aspects of the negotiations down to the last minute. But it's a very clear recommitment of the international community to a world without nuclear weapons and the elimination of such weapons. And that's quite significant. It's the first time in more than a decade that something like that has happened. There are certainly elements from our perspective, I think, that we would have liked to have seen more of. For example, more on transparency and confidence building also among nuclear weapon states. But I think the fact that this was achieved at a time of real, acute nuclear risk, globally speaking, that's a real breakthrough. And so I think the question is then, as you said, what comes next? I think it is still a little bit unclear, what can be how the pact may be helpful for future processes. I'm thinking in particular of the 2026 review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether this will play a role and can provide impetus. We will need to see, but I think there are many other aspects also in the pact, also going beyond just nuclear weapons, where there are some clear signals, and you mentioned also the kind of general commitment to revitalizing the global disarmament regime and the role that the United Nations needs to play within that. Also, mention of strengthening instruments to address other weapons of mass destruction, particularly biorisks, but also ensuring that we preserve a world free of chemical and biological weapons. But I think one of the more concrete asks also of the Secretary General of the UN is actually in Action 13, which speaks about the SG providing an analysis on the impact of the global rise in military spending on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there, I think that's particularly important, again, in looking at how does disarmament also contribute to these broader multilateral frameworks and goals, whether it's sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, et cetera. So there's also other dimensions that you didn't necessarily mention, Markus, like ones related to protecting civilians in armed conflict, specifically refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. This is certainly an issue of concern if we look at current ongoing conflicts. Also dealing with the risks associated with small arms and light weapons, but also this emerging tech dimension, Markus, that you mentioned, in different aspects of that. Military applications of artificial intelligence are mentioned. I think this general idea of what should global governance around artificial intelligence look like is a big question mark for the international community. We heard it a lot, not just at the summit, but also at the UN General Assembly and high-level segment the following days. There is also specific language in there around advancing negotiations and measures to prevent an arms race in outer space. From our perspective, we would have liked to have seen stronger language on lethal autonomous weapon systems. The Secretary General has called for a ban on such weapons by 2026. That is not reflected to that extent in the pact, but you do see also points on advancing processes related to lethal autonomous weapons. Similarly, on ICT security aspects, perhaps not as strong actions or statements specifically on what would be the next steps, especially upholding norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. It's not there explicitly in the pact, but I think there is quite a lot there. And so I am indeed in New York this week. I'm at the first committee, which will no doubt be taking up a number of these issues, and we will see a little bit in terms of how states decide to also bring some of these dimensions into such processes. The first committee is obviously not the only one. I mentioned the NPT review conference. There are other platforms that will certainly play a role on the multilateral level. I think there's a fragile consensus around the pact. Certainly in the negotiations, the pushback on certain language, agreed language, including on humanitarian disarmament aspects, is something that does cause some concern. But as you've said, and I think as the Secretary General said, this is a jumping off point. It's now the door is open. How do we walk through it? As I think was also on the concept note for this event. And so I mentioned some of the multilateral processes and the role that no doubt will be important also for the UN to play. But I think disarmament has always been this web of different layers of commitments, of instruments at the multilateral level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the bilateral level, in particular between the big military powers and between nuclear weapon states. So, I think we'll need to see also steps and actions across those different layers going forward. And so I'm really excited to hear from the other panelists also about the thoughts on the contributions that different stakeholders can take. Certainly from the UN side, we are assessing, looking at what are the specific asks of the UN, of the Secretary General, but also, again, what will be some of the implications coming out of different multilateral processes for how we take this forward. So it's still very much an unwritten conclusion, really just at the start of a journey. I think, Markus, would be my main answer to you. But looking forward to the discussion, and I'll leave it at there for now, and we can elaborate when we get into the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
I think we can quickly, yes. Rebecca, thanks a lot for a really brilliant overview of what is in these many, many, many pages. So it was very succinct, and I think the start of a journey. I think that's a very, very good metaphor. Then we're going to go on with Jaewoo. So what's your take on all of this?
First of all, thank you to Rebecca for the invitation, and UNODA for organizing the event, and for the Diplomatic Academy for hosting us and me. It's great to be here and to speak to you. And first, I want to start with a disclaimer. As Markus said, I'm a researcher looking not so much at the developments that happen in the multilateral context, but more looking at, what are nuclear armed states actually doing in terms of developing their capabilities, what kind of policies are they adopting, and how are they changing over time. So I'm really more of an outsider looking at these issues. And so any questions that relate to the process, the summit, I think they should go to the other Markus. That being said, looking at the nuclear regime and relations between nuclear armed states, these days it's really, really difficult to be very optimistic about the future. And I can just go a bit into some of the key challenges I see, but so I just want to start off with that, to say that I really welcomed this opportunity to reflect on a document and a process, I think that can give us some hope for the future. And I will highlight 3 reflections, or so much of those will echo what Rebecca already said. But I think, just to start off, it's it is indeed significant that the international community was able to come together to produce this document that is a commitment to both non-proliferation and disarmament. There's a multilateral support of the 1985 Gorbachev-Reagan statement, which was repeated by the P5 in January 2022, that nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. You can. This kind of statement is, is just a statement, but just the fact that the P5 at that time were able to agree to recommit to this very basic principle was significant at the time, and it's significant again that in the broader multilateral context, this support was reissued, and there are a few other things that I want to highlight in just a minute. But just some of the challenges, I think we need to be very realistic about the state of nuclear risks and the regime overall. I think we've seen increased salience of nuclear weapons in many countries' security policies. We've seen lack of progress on disarmament obligations for a very long time, and developments that put some pressure on the non-proliferation regime. And on that specifically, in the NPT context, we've seen very strong divisions, and many now describe this process as having ended up in a sort of credibility crisis. With in the recent PrepCom here not here but in Geneva over the summer, states were merely able to adopt the chair's summary as a working paper, no agreed outcome, and this is following 2 failed review cycles where there was no agreed outcome. And so we're looking forward to seeing what the current review cycle will end up with, but just to say that it's really difficult to be optimistic given all these developments on modernization, on the state of just peaceful relations. The many conflicts that we see at the moment, they complicate disarmament efforts and also the non-proliferation regime. So to maybe turn the page from that maybe a bit more pessimistic note to what I see as really quite noteworthy from the pact is, and Rebecca already mentioned much of that. The very first thing I want to repeat again, though, is that there are specific, I think, 2 articles, right, that speak to disarmament in very explicit terms. But you see, if you consider now the disarmament agenda more broadly, but also thinking about nuclear issues these days, it's so entangled in developments in peace and security affairs more broadly. So if you read closely and in between the lines of many of the articles, you see issues that are relevant to disarmament. This ranges, from emerging technologies, what Markus already mentioned, but also issues related to outer space and lethal autonomous weapons, an issue that's very much prioritized here in Austria, for example. The second thing I want to highlight is it's very forward-looking, the document, but at the same time, it's very cognizant of the current challenges and threats to the international regime. So there's a clear recognition of current risks, and to quote, the immediate goal being the elimination of the danger of nuclear war and implementation of measures to avoid an arms race, and to take all possible steps to prevent nuclear war. So risk reduction, even though it's not explicitly mentioned, is I think, very much a focus that you can also see in the NPT context these days. There has been some pushback by some on this agenda item in the NPT context, with some viewing it as perhaps a distraction to disarmament, or maybe not really enhancing international security. But reading here this pact, I think we see an endorsement of a focus, at least, on the immediate risks and trying to address them. And just the last thing I want to highlight is, and Rebecca already mentioned this broad participation we've seen in the context of the summit, but also I think we see this in other fora as well. The global south is much more engaged on these issues, particularly since the humanitarian initiative, and it's become their contributions. They shape the agenda more and more, and I think we see that a bit also in what's been happening in the context of the summit. And so I don't think to your question, perhaps, I don't think the pact gives us a clear pathway on how to move forward for the very challenging disarmament issues, including on bridging divides between what the global south, much of the global south is pushing for on the humanitarian initiative side of things and the P5. But it gives us optimism and language that can be used to maybe shape also discussions in other fora. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also deserves a round of applause. So thanks a lot. That was specifically now on the issue of nuclear weapons, yeah, because the language in the pact is very strong. I mean, fairly strong, right? We will advance the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons, yeah, and that's probably something we have to go back then in the questions and answers and the discussion, and I think Jaewoo's contribution is actually very precious, because there may be a discrepancy there, right? Because between what we see on the one hand, what has been going on for many years, and the language that we see in the pact. Yeah? But obviously there may also be, and that going back to the question about the momentum, maybe there could be a momentum to change this established pattern, discouraging pattern. And Rebecca, I think, hinted at that in several times in quite interesting ways. Then Markus, we're going to go on with you because we share the same first name. No, we are going to continue because you've actually been there at the Summit of the Future. So you can tell us perhaps a little bit about what happened there, and also on our question: is the pact going to help us towards new momentum for disarmament and arms control?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for involving a young person in this discussion, something that is often not done. And thank you all for coming today and spending this evening with us. I'm glad to be here because this is a discussion that is very timely and that is also very important to young people. I'm happy to share my perspective, both as a youth delegate, which is especially informed by the fact that for young people in Austria, according to the 8th Youth Report and by the federal government, but also the ÖFG Youth Survey, peace and war and security, are among the most pressing issues that young people express when they express their anxiety about the future. On the other hand, my perspective is also informed by the fact that I lived in Senegal, in West Africa, working at the embassy during a time when there were many coups in the region, and I talked to other young people who were very much affected by security issues, and especially about the security climate nexus face to face. So as other panelists and also Rebecca have been able to share maybe much more eloquently and in detail, is that we are happy that there is very strong language on certain issues in the pact. For example, a commitment to tackling root causes of insecurity in Action 14, strong language on nuclear weapons in Action 25, or the threat of nuclear war being mentioned in the first sentence of the second chapter. More on disarmament in Action 26, and also decent language on the role of the United Nations in cooperation between regional and sub-regional organizations in Action 55. So as young people, we are very happy about that, and we celebrate those positive achievements. We recognize their significance. To keep it brief, overall my takeaway is that while the international community recognizes the urgency of security measures and their devastating impact, also, but not only, but very strongly also in young people, sadly, young people are not often enough seen as active contributors to peace initiatives, and their active role in shaping peace and security has been neglected. So from a youth perspective, we regret that despite the 3 Security Council resolutions in 2015, 2018, and 2020 that require UN member states to ensure youth involvement in all decision-making levels, in conflict prevention and also in supporting youth-led peace initiatives, and additional 2 reports by the Secretary General on the youth, peace and security agenda, we were unable to have a commitment as concrete as, for example, the establishment of a national youth, peace and security action plan in every member state. We think that there is an opportunity that was missed. However, there are highlights as well, as I said before, but also in Action 20. Action 20 is on accelerating the implementation of youth, peace and security commitments, so talking about those commitments made in the resolutions from 2015, 18 and 20. And it outlines, for example, full and safe participation of youth, which is essential for global peace and security, since being engaged in peace initiatives can often come with a great risk, especially for young people who are vulnerable in so many ways. And also, of course, strengthening the implementation of national and regional youth, peace and security roadmaps. There is one thing that we regret very much from the 3rd revision to the final pact. There is an action, which used to be Action 20, relating to the nexus between climate and peace and security, which is highly relevant to youth, especially those young people that I talked to in Senegal, for example, that has disappeared from the pact. We were so excited about this that we actually planned a side event where this was a central theme and then had to adapt it when it was no longer part of the pact. I have more notes on the Declaration on Future Generations, but maybe I will keep this for the
actually,
Q&A.
a few words would be good about that, if you don't mind.
Okay. So what is positive about the Declaration on Future Generations is, on one hand, that peace and security are featured quite prominently. So the first guiding principle, the first commitment. So the start of 2 of these chapters start with issues on security, and what we think will truly make a difference is the proposal of the appointment of a special envoy on future generations, which will be able to bundle information on the implementation, but also ensure more transparency and more accountability with member states. This, of course, relates to all the commitments made, but of course, especially also to peace and security commitments and actions described in the Declaration on Future Generations.
Markus, thanks very much. Today we actually have 2 interesting issues on the table, right? So there's one in terms of substance, arms control and disarmament, and 2 in terms of procedure. So who negotiates, who makes decisions, who is entitled to have a voice, basically. And I think that's an important point. Stefanie.
Okay, now it's up to me. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for bringing the topic disarmament and nuclear disarmament back on the agenda, because as the topic says, a new momentum for arms control and disarmament. I very much must say, in my own experience, I must say it's unfortunately, very unfortunately, a no. I've been in many, many discussions in the recent month in many countries inside Europe, also a little bit outside of traditional European Union countries. And always when I bring up this topic and say, we need to discuss nuclear disarmament in general, people would tell me, no, now is not the time to talk about it. And my response always is, no, exactly right now is the time to talk about it. So why is this the case? I do think really we need to look a little bit on the world as it is right now. And as much as I appreciate that the United Nations have been able to pull off this pact, I must say I was quite astonished that this actually happened in these times, because if we look at what is going on in the world, I mean, we are seeing some very, very concerning trends, and I think it is kind of my obligation also to point a little bit on what is going on in the world. We are going away from this multipolarity, from this multilateralism, international world order, as we used to call it, where we had this understanding after the Second World War, saying never again. Now what we are witnessing is not only the war against Ukraine, but we are seeing what is happening there. And I remember very, very vividly that the European Union in that case, since it was very, very close to Europe, that we actually managed to stand strongly together, condemning it, coming up with sanctions. But then we forgot about something else, which was the so-called Global South, because they actually said, you know, we are not actually in favor of what Russia is doing there, but we are not really seeing it as such a huge problem as you are doing. And the question behind it is not that they actually thought that Russia is doing a good thing, but they actually had the feeling that the international world order is not really, that they have been treated with arrogance for the last couple of years and that they have not been considered. So the sanctions policy came into play there. And I'm not actually making the case for that, because very, very obviously it was illegal, unprovoked war. But nevertheless, this is also how, in a multipolar world, like many other countries are seeing what is going on there. On the other hand, we are facing right now, and I think today is also a very, very difficult timing actually to come up with this, because yesterday was the first anniversary of the Hamas attack against Gaza, which obviously is a terrorist attack, and it was super brutal and criminal. But then again, we are facing there now a whole year with extremely humanitarian disaster, many civilians dead, etc. So the whole brink there, it's literally, it's devastating what is going on there. On the other hand, there is Sudan, there is Ethiopia. Those are the conflicts we are not really talking too much about. So in general, I think it's very, very difficult to say that we are actually having some kind of what we call that this liberal world order, we actually at once came together to say never again, that we are actually upholding it. So I think this is one of the biggest problems, and I think it is very, very important to restore this credibility if you want to come to nuclear disarmament in the future. We have been seeing since the war against Ukraine that Russia has been setting a new trend by actually using nuclear coercion against something which actually was not on the table for many, many years. We do hear about the lethal autonomic weapon system, so we do have also, I would say, difficult additional trends we are facing, which is how do we deal actually with artificial intelligence and wars, and how they are actually also applied. And we also know that Israel has been doing that in the war against Gaza. I mean, we know that they are using artificial intelligence actually to identify targets, which obviously then also leads to identifying more targets than humans would actually be seeing. So these are all very, very difficult issues we are facing in times when actually we're also talking about we need to rearm ourselves because the danger is very, very big. So I think the time is very, very important that we talk again about disarmament and nuclear disarmament. And I do think this is also where civil society comes in to also discuss about possible, what would it mean, nuclear deterrence? What does nuclear deterrence even mean? We are having this discussion that we need to enhance nuclear deterrence because of what Russia is doing. But nobody really challenges what nuclear deterrence actually in fact is, because it means if you want to be a nuclear deterrent power, it means that you need to be ready to use nuclear weapons. And this is something I think is very important also to understand. So I think the time is very, very right to discuss the issues. I don't think that we are having a new momentum these times. I do think we are facing so much problems when it comes to this international world order. We need to restore credibility, and that means for every one of us in the West, in the South, to actually uphold humanitarian law, to uphold international humanitarian law, to uphold human rights, no matter who is perpetrating crimes or not. And I think this is part of the problem. And if we are not managing to do that, I think that no agreement will be reached. The golden era, very unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, of arms control seems to be over. There is not a lot left, and the whole, I would say, atmosphere in which disarmament discussions have been taking place becomes more difficult because of the technological advances, but also because of this shift from this, let's call it, the so-called rules-based unipolar world order, then to the Cold War, where it was mostly the US and the Soviet Union, so two players. Now we are facing a much more diverse world order. We're talking about polarism. So many countries, they actually don't want to choose sides, but they are still acting there, and they also are looking for their own security, and their own security is first. And what is actually left out there is the human security and also the humanitarian security. And this is why I even prefer what Mr. Guterres, not in the pact before, but in his new agenda for peace, was making a very, very big case on, is the humanitarian-centered disarmament, actually talking about that all disarmaments and all the weapons are actually having an impact on humans, and that should be maybe the priority and not the state security, because state security is normally very, very isolated and tends not to neglect also the security of other states, of other groups, etc. I can leave it all there, but I'm very, very happy to engage in future discussions, and on many different topics. I have much more notes here.
Stephanie, thanks a lot. There was also a lot in there, just to highlight, probably was overall a more pessimistic point of view than, let's say, we got from Rebecca. Maybe one more thing that I'd like to highlight, because it's sometimes tempting if one talks about disarmament and arms control to only look at the big weapons, yeah, like nuclear weapons, biological, chemical, and so on. But small arms, light weapons, obviously, are also a massive problem. When we think about Ethiopia, Sudan, and that obviously is a pressing issue, along with all kinds of other things like drone warfare and everything as well. I know that you are a very active audience, so let me stop talking actually, and let me open up the floor. And please, so indicate actually who you are, and a little bit, and then direct the question to either one of the panelists you want to direct it to, or to several of them, and just indicate that. I'm going to start with you in the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Marvin. I have the pleasure of studying here. My question is generally about this issue, or it's comprised of many parts. Let's start with the first one. I think it's a bit unfortunate that in the Pact of the Future currently, it is regarded as if we need securitization first before we can start with the disarmament track. This is one of the first things that it actually says in regards to nuclear disarmament, whilst obviously a disarmament perspective would see it the other way around. Of course, disarming leads to more stability. So I would love to hear an opinion on that. And secondly, what I think is also quite relevant with the pact is that whilst and thank you for mentioning the humanitarian consequences, whilst the climate security nexus has been cutting out, the humanitarian nexus seems to have been lost a bit more, apart from mentioning of the WPS and YPS agenda maybe. And I think finally, apart from that, I would really love to get your opinion. Today we had the news that a lot of states, so Russia, Argentina, disengaged from the whole pact, but other states did so as well. We know Iran, Nicaragua, other states did from certain paras. How do you view that in regards to the implementation of the pact? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're always going to bundle 3 questions, so maybe to make it easy for you, the neighbor, right? Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for your input. Lev Töpfer, also from the MICE 1 program. My question concerns emerging technologies in outer space. You mentioned that PAROS is mentioned in the pact, but the development of responsible norms is not. Now we're looking at a time where 2 working groups will work in parallel, and we heard something about the problems of reaching inputs for nuclear disarmament, but this is quite the same in space security, so I would love to hear from you and maybe from you, Rebecca, Jovin, how this pact might affect those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And then we have room for another one. Maybe Elmar, because I just saw you. Yeah.
So I'm the MICE 2 student, and my question is not directly to any specific panelist, but in general. I guess in promoting the disarmament, the nuclear disarmament, and also conventional arms disarmament, there is one critical issue is about the guarantees. I mean, if a country is willing to give up its weapon, who would guarantee that this country would not be under attack in the future afterwards? And I mean, it's really critical nowadays, especially when we have the bright example, for example, of, let's say, Ukraine, that under international pressure, under pressure of Western powers mainly, but also in general, international community gave up its nuclear arsenal just for nothing. And moreover, then also they robbed Ukraine's conventional weaponry. And now the country is under attack, and international community barely does anything to protect the country. And this is just one of the examples that concerns, let's say, Europe. But there are also other examples in less, I would say, known for the wider audience in Caucasus, in Africa, and when the countries are under attack and international against the UN Charter, against the international law, and international community does actually nothing. I mean, yes, we have the mechanisms of Security Council, but it works only when it comes to Kuwait or Libya, but not to other countries. I mean, are there any mechanisms to be strengthened or created or established that can assure other countries voluntarily give up their arms and not be afraid to be invaded afterwards? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's a lot of big questions, actually, right? And amongst the panelists, feel free to go for whatever you want. I'm just going to repeat very, very, very quickly. So there was the question about does stability breed disarmament or the other way around? There was a question about space security. There were questions about state commitments to the pact just a few days later. There were questions about nuclear guarantees or security guarantees more generally, and about whether we need new mechanisms, a new security architecture. I know these are all very big questions, so with the panelists, whoever wants to go for one of them or two, go ahead. Then, Rebecca, yes.
I'm happy to. It was indeed a lot, but thank you so much. Some great questions. And I mean, Marvin, your points on, disarmament as a prerequisite or as a catalyst for security versus security as a prerequisite for disarmament. I mean, I would pick up what Stephanie said in that disarmament is absolutely an instrument, a tool for security, and is in fact at times of crisis that it is needed all the more. So I do think there is a recognition of that in the pact, and also the role that disarmament plays as a preventative tool, but also as a conflict resolution tool, as a de-escalation tool. And I think it is quite important to put those kinds of issues and that issue back into the conversation for precisely the reasons that also Stephanie outlined. And I think there's lots of historic examples that show that disarmament is really a tool that has been utilized to great effect at times of heightened tension and crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis. At the peak of that, it was basically the former Soviet Union and the United States that decided and agreed to far-reaching arms control measures. And so, we have these historic examples and proof that disarmament can be a very catalytic tool. And so I think bringing that narrative back is very, very important at this time. I also appreciate some of the comments that were made about the human-centered disarmament. Indeed, that was very central to the Secretary General's input to the Summit of the Future through his new agenda for peace. And I think it is there, but as some have said, perhaps a bit hidden in some of the actions, and really, you know, for us, from the UN perspective, I think what's important is to kind of also bring back this notion of human security as complementary and mutually enforcing of national security and collective security. And so if we can use certain actions or elements in the pact to kind of also bring that back to the fore, that would be a very positive thing. And I think, as you said, Markus, sometimes you need to read a little bit between the lines, not just the headline actions, but what is actually behind there to find some of these elements. On the question of space security, so sorry if I was misunderstood before. When I was talking about the language around responsible norms of behavior, I was referring to ICTs. There is quite a bit in the pact on space security, but also space sustainability, and I think both of those are really, really important. And especially here in Vienna, there's of course a lot of international multilateral processes dealing specifically with peaceful uses of outer space and with space sustainability aspects, where I think there are some concrete things in the pact that will be quite instrumental in terms of how those bodies take these issues forward. But I think, you know, on your question of bringing together the various tracks right now on the more behavioral-based approach when it comes to outer space and the more kind of legal ones in preventing an arms race in outer space, there is ongoing discussion around this, and you know there will be some potential ways forward that also emerge, I think, in the coming weeks, including through discussions here and elsewhere. And certainly, I know that the chairs of various processes are quite engaged on this issue. So we'll have to see a little bit, but there are quite a lot of moving pieces on these different tracks that will be, I think, definitely very, very important. I wanted to just say one issue or respond to one point, maybe to dispel a bit of a misunderstanding, because I think oftentimes when the issue of nuclear weapons related to Ukraine comes up, I think it's very important to emphasize that Ukraine was never a nuclear weapons state. The nuclear weapons stationed on Ukrainian territory were never under the command and control of Ukraine. And so I think it's very, very important to not kind of to be very clear on Ukraine's historical status in that regard. In terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have the 5 nuclear weapon states, and there are different instruments also that address this issue that was raised about negative security insurances and so forth, and maybe Jaewoo and others will have some comments on that. But I did want to just emphasize there, just to avoid any confusion also about Ukraine when it comes to nuclear weapons specifically, because I think this is often a little bit simplified in some of the discourse. So I'll leave it at that for now. If I missed anything, I'm really sorry. I'm happy to come back to it. So you can definitely remind me if I jumped over any questions. But thanks for the opportunity to make a few comments.
Rebecca, thanks a lot. Is there anyone else who wants to do
maybe just
things?
Just very briefly on your comment on some countries distancing themselves from the pact. I haven't followed the details too much as said, but if I remember some of the comments that have been reported in the aftermath. There's been from Russia especially a focus on the wording of accelerated efforts towards disarmament, and I think in the comments the international situation is cited as just making it not feasible to accelerate efforts, right? And I think that really was voiced in very explicit terms by Russia, but I think you can other nuclear weapon states have similar positions, obviously to varying degrees, but if you follow the debates that happen more in the NPT context or positions that have been voiced vis-à-vis the TPNW and many of the nuclear weapon states, if not most, opposing the humanitarian initiative and TPNW efforts, I think you can very much see this very strong position that nuclear deterrence in those states' view is seen as the priority at the moment, and any efforts that would go towards accelerating efforts to disarmament are viewed as just not right for the moment. So there's been some focus on still advancing the disarmament agenda and trying to bring these different camps together. So I think, as said, I think it's very significant that in this pact there's strong language on just disarmament specifically, and the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It doesn't really tell us how we should go about disarmament. So there's been there's been some discussion on risk reduction measures that I highlighted before, and I think it can provide us an avenue that maybe can be merged also a bit more with some of the language that has come out of the summit on focusing on acute nuclear risks and ways to mitigate those. So I think that there are some avenues that can provide us some hope. Just on the last question on, I think challenges to the non-proliferation regime broadly, that more and more states are really asking themselves, is this bargain really credible? Does it make sense for our security? Should we not have nuclear weapons ourselves? And especially when nuclear weapon states and other possessing states are not making much progress with disarmament. I think this really is a very important point in general terms, because it really reflects the challenges we have with upholding the broader regime, and I don't really have good recommendations in that sense, but there is a reference to nuclear weapon-free zones and other kinds of security assurances that are referenced there, but also are still being discussed in the NPT context.
Thank you. Are you guys okay? Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, maybe briefly also highlighting what Rebecca said, and maybe also to your question about Budapest Memorandum, more or less. I think it's very, very important to say that Ukraine, in essence, I mean, this argument is there all the time, that they say if we would not have given up in the Budapest Memorandum the nuclear weapons, Russia would not have attacked us. I mean, the story obviously is a little bit more complicated. Rebecca pointed it out quite well. They never actually had the codes and whatever. They never actually owned the nukes and could have whatever used them. On the other hand, problematic is, and I think this is very important, is also what you said about security guarantees. Now, this is something very important, because the problem is that all these wars and conflicts are so complex. It's literally, I mean, I would say, in my point of view, what Russia is doing in Ukraine is partly an imperial war, obviously. I mean, they're denying existence of Ukrainians and whatever. They want them to be in their sphere of influence on the one hand, but on the other hand, and Putin says that himself, it's an everlasting war against the West. So it's a never-ending war against the West. And the war is taking place on all levels. So, I mean, Ukraine is the battlefield, I mean, where the weapons are falling on Ukrainian people, but there is also the disinformation campaign, there is also the energy sphere, it goes to the cyberspace, etc. So it's a very, very complicated situation. And I do very much understand that Ukraine at one point is saying, I mean, we are fighting this partly also for you, maybe not alone, but how actually can we get security guarantees? And this is the big question we need to find an answer if we actually also decide beforehand which is what we call in the security analysis, the so-called security dilemma, is when we expand our security, it is actually affecting the perception of security of another state. So, I mean, we can argue about, is NATO really a security threat for Russia or not? I would say NATO has not intended to do something with Russia, but Russians are seeing it differently. And if we are not seeing that they are seeing it also differently, it's going to be very complicated. So we need also to see the security dilemma, and if we then bring Ukraine into this situation, we need to come up with security guarantees, which we obviously, at this moment, unfortunately, are not willing to give them. So I think it's a very, very sad situation. Ukraine is fighting there, people are dying, and nobody really has a plan. And this is something very, very difficult to digest in my point of view. On the other hand, since Russia is a nuclear power, you can also have the feeling that, you know, NATO is not intervening, and Polish army or whatever, or NATO allies are not intervening, although they are making a very, very strong case. They are not doing it because there is this nuclear threat in the end. So you do have, on the one hand, you know, also this idea that because Russia is a nuclear power, they can actually wage a conventional war against Ukraine, and more or less we are trying to support, but not really. So it gives us a limbo. So I do think that this is the very important question, is what about security guarantees? Who is willing and able to give them security guarantees? And I think this question has not been tackled within the European Union yet. We're talking about possible future membership of Ukraine. There is not yet an action membership plan. So I think this is really the question we need to ask, and it's a very, very difficult one, so to say. On the other hand, also the same discussion about if we would have nuclear weapons led to many other countries also seeking, maybe we should also get nuclear weapons because of the deterrent argument. But the threat of actually mutual destruction is, for me, not really a very sustainable security order in the long term. So this is something where we actually need to challenge this whole nuclear deterrence argument, and this is also where civil society might come in. Is this really, I mean, does anyone believe that nuclear deterrence is going to work forever? It might have been working for a couple of years, 60, 70 years, but nevertheless, I mean, wars are still ongoing. They are ongoing conventionally, but there are also a lot of other weapon systems developed. I mean, the lethal autonomic weapon systems have been discussed already earlier. So there are so many questions when it comes to disarmament. So really thinking about how actually can we create a credible security architecture within Europe, but then also on a global level. And I do think this is what the pact is essentially then back again about, is that we really need to come back to the norms we actually agreed upon. And that means that every one of us needs to uphold them, no matter who it is. So invading Iraq was wrong and illegal. International law applies to everyone, no matter who it is. So I think this might be part of the solution. I don't really see it happening right now, but I think this is the only thing which I think is kind of suitable for the future. Otherwise, I'm so sorry to be a little bit grim, but the world politics does not give me many other options today.
The international rule of law, yeah, it's not in very good shape. This, I think, I've written down a few names, right? I think there are lots of people who want to ask questions. So let me actually very, very briefly, hands up who wants to ask questions, because wow. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, but that we can do. Then let's do that in one go, if that's okay. And we're going to start with Ambassador Soltanay, and then we're gonna move over there.
Thank you very much. I want to commend the panelists for this event. The answer to your event is positive. Merely having this meeting is one of the, in fact, reasons that I am optimist that there is a new momentum. However, I have to remind that Austrian very positive gesture for humanitarian aspects which led to a new treaty, TP and WT. That was a good gesture, and the whole world thought that this is a new momentum, a new chapter. But gradually we are getting used to it, and now faded away. Nobody talked about it. The weapon state totally boycotted, no objection, and as if that many, even intellectuals, they don't know what's TP and W all about. Therefore, we hope that this time we all, intellectuals, think tanks, take this opportunity seriously. Otherwise, this is worse. The reason is because this diffused the pressure on weapon states. These kind of gestures, the decisions, the meeting in New York, all these kind of things. This is my 40 years of experience that we have to be careful. Seize an opportunity, take the momentum and continuity. Otherwise, it would be worse than even having these statements. I read that statement, but this is somehow repetitive what we have seen in Committee 1 also. One comment, just and stop it here. Working 40 years in WMD and disarmament, particularly nuclear, there's one serious food for thought. Nuclear disarmament is the victim of nuclear arms control. Why? Because by merely arms control, the whole world were forced to accept the legitimacy of nuclear weapon. It means that they said we have the nuclear weapon, it is legitimized, we try to control it. And it means that the nuclear disarmament was put aside, working years, we have noticed that. And the whole world were looking for two superpowers that they would negotiate, and unfortunately, even intellectuals were applauding that they agreed to reduce a couple of hundred warheads. For God's sakes, they should dismantle all of them. And they modernized them, but they reduced number of them. And we see the situation now. This event in New York or so was provoked by Global South, because they noticed, they came to conclusion, enough is enough. We cannot take it granted that you, nuclear weaponists, said do whatever you wanted. Therefore, I welcome this gesture, but I'm worried that we have to take this the serious matter and keep the momentum. And I want to recall also CD, I'm sure that the dear friend Rebecca knows, because I was ambassador 20 years ago in CD in Geneva. Unfortunately, for 24 years more, CD in Geneva in a stalemate. And nobody cares. The ambassadors go, have a tea, coffee, and then nothing is going on. And intellectuals, think tanks, even don't mention CD or whatever is going on there. Therefore, I think this is the time to work on it. I said that the disarmament, nuclear disarmament is victim of arms control, is also victim of non-proliferation. Why? By highlighting non-proliferation nuclear weapon, they put aside again on the nuclear disarmament. As everybody knows, of course, I don't want to take time, Article 6. Article 6 of NPT doesn't have any timeline. And whenever we question the weapon states in all NPT conferences that I've been participating for over 40 years, they said, well, in the Article 6, they said we negotiate, we are still negotiating. And therefore, half a century goes and nothing happened. And I propose in Geneva and New York also, myself, that this is the time to amend Article 6. We have to do real action-oriented proposal so that it will make a change. I think that this is a food for thought. I'm sorry I didn't want to have any question, but I want really to commend this arrangement. I commend the Diplomatic Academy or whoever the organizer, and of course, the Office of Disarmament. I hope that they can take this matter. This is another unique opportunity. We shouldn't lose this opportunity and try to keep momentum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Then I think Ismail, you were next on my list. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Ismail. I'm my student here at DDA, and my question is not to like one specific person, but in general, what is the difference between this current document and other like international agreements we already had? What's the difference? Because it's like we already had many of them, many of the documents which claim that we must disarm, we must control weapons. But especially this document, for example, I personally can't see any differences in how it can help, because as already was mentioned, Russia openly said that disarmament clause isn't acceptable, and Russia distanced itself from the consensus. And I read some other actions, and I'm pretty sure that no P5 country would ever agree on nuclear disarmament or limiting veto power. It's just against their national interests, and why would they do that? And so there was also, it's like, in my opinion, the disarmament and arms control is possible only when there is a good geopolitical environment and good relations between great powers. which happened during the Cold War, during the detente, and also after the end of the Soviet Union. So only good geopolitical environment could actually facilitate to disarmament. So in current situations, when there is great power competition back, how can this document change? What's new in this document? So what exactly can we do with it? Thank you.
Thank you. And then, wow, let's just go 1, 2, 3. And then maybe I'm gonna at some station stop the list because it's gonna get too long.
My name is Victoria. I'm also a MIS2 student, and I think I have a follow-up question on P5 because they've all signed this document, but as far as I understand, this is just a declaration of intentions, which basically means they have no obligations under the document. And I had a look at the statements made by P5 countries after and before the summit, and well, in the statements of France, the UK, and the US, there is not a single word in the priority lists about disarmament. The Chinese, well, I didn't find their final statement, but before the summit, they said that they would be in favor, but only when the Western countries and Russia disarm. And as Ismail has just mentioned, Russia said that they oppose the acceleration of the nuclear disarmament process against the background of ignoring the principle of equal and indivisible security. So that's a question probably more to Rebecca, because she was very positive about this, at least starting point. So how would you compare this at the same time they signed the document, but it's not legally binding? And then in the final statements, they make no reference to this very part of the document or oppose it even. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll do the two of you, and then shelve the rest, because otherwise it's going to get too much. Yeah.
My name is Ata Aliyev. I'm a second-year MIS student. First of all, thank you very much for giving us this lecture, and thanks to the DA for hosting this event. It was really interesting and useful to kind of get these insights into the Summit of the Future and nuclear disarmament realm as a whole. So basically, I have two questions. First of all, the previous century, as well as some of the recent events, showed a strong positive correlation between public opinion and positive, I would say, just major political events, political narratives, including nuclear disarmament and arms control sphere. But at the same time, more surveys show that more and more people are not that concerned with this dimension as much as they were concerned, for example, after the end of the Cold War. And so basically, they don't really consider the current order, the current situation as a problematic one, and they are quite satisfied with some powers still possessing nuclear arsenals and even some politicians making statements about using it. So in this regard, I wanted to ask, what is actually the UNODA's capacity in this regard? Like, does it, and if yes, how does it affect the public opinion in this sense, to kind of translate the main principles of arms control and nuclear disarmament into the general public? And the second question is kind of a continuation of what Ismail and Vika asked. So basically, when I was reading about the key takeaways of the Summit of the Future, and you also mentioned that it is once in a generation UN conference, much in the sense that almost all of the states restated their commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons as well, but at the same time, and this was reflected in the third revision of the People's Pact for the Future, the final document reflecting the results of the UN conference, but at the same time, the nuclear powers, they opposed this document by publishing the fourth revision of the exact document, in which they removed this exact statement by, I would say, a much weaker text saying that, well, the final objective of the states is not really the abolition of nuclear weapons, but rather the elimination of the threat of a nuclear war. So that is why I wanted to ask, do you really think that this summit of the future really brought in some significant changes to the current order, nuclear disarmament and arms control narrative. Yeah.
Thank you. And one more.
My name is Ekaterina Glagoleva. I'm also a MIS2 student. Should I take it? You mentioned deteriorated relations between nuclear powers, but I have a question on non-nuclear powers, non-recognized powers, as we see what is happening in the Middle East, and the world is preoccupied of how it can end. And my question is how we can prevent new countries of obtaining nuclear weapons, because that is a trend for many years now, and this is happening. And what is next?
Thank you. There was also a very big question. I'm sorry that I have to close the list for the discussion, because otherwise it's just going to get too long. I suggest that maybe in the order in which they started to present, that the panelists just reflect a little bit upon what has been said, pick out maybe a few questions that have just been asked that I wanna say something about, and maybe do so in about 3 minutes or so. Rebecca, you're gonna go first.
Tall order, Markus.
I know.
So much to say, so little time. No, listen, great questions and comments. I mean, I think in terms of what's unique about this document, it is that it's really a comprehensive declaration, and as I said, also with quite a lot of specific actions and commitments. But it's really unique in that it addresses such a breadth of issues and really recognizes the interconnectedness of risks and threats and what is needed by the international community to change course and also to make the UN more fit for purpose. I mean, we all recognize the world is not the same one that it was at the end of the Second World War. And so I think that is very, very unique. And as the ambassador was saying too, this momentum, I mean, not just on the disarmament elements, but in general, in terms of what it means for multilateralism, it has to be seized. And so it is unique, even if it is not a legally binding document. It is unique in the range of issues that it addresses and the kind of pathway that it signals for the international community. And I mean, there's so much in there that we haven't even talked about that is quite potentially far-reaching. And we'll see how some of these issues evolve too, from Security Council reform to revitalizing the international financial systems, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, as I said at the outset, it's an opening, and so I don't think on many of these there will have to be kind of ongoing processes, and some of those will likely be within the UN context and under UN auspices, but not all of them. And so we have to really look at these different levels in terms of how many of these issues can be taken forward. I definitely share the concerns that have been raised about states distancing themselves from certain elements. You know, from a legal standpoint, one has to see what that means. But more importantly, it's then a question of how will those states also engage in processes, in formal intergovernmental processes that are also tackling these issues. And I think, you know, that jury is obviously still out. Any multilateral negotiation process will result in compromise. That is the nature of diplomacy and how it works. So certainly I've mentioned a couple of things that we would have liked to have seen in the final pact that were not there, but this is the nature of negotiations. And I do think, you know, in general, if you look at statements made at the General Assembly, 95 states out of the 190 that spoke did mention disarmament issues. That's about half. I mean, would it be nice that it be all of them? Absolutely. But it is quite a lot of states that see this issue as very, very pertinent. And I want to really emphasize what the ambassador and what others have said too about the role of the Global South. I think it played an incredibly important role in taking this pact to its conclusion. And I think there's a lot that also states, in particular in the non-nuclear weapon states, can do in terms of holding nuclear weapon states to account to their legal obligations. And the treaties that I've mentioned and that others have mentioned, there are legal obligations that nuclear weapon states and have committed to through those processes. And so if this can serve also to kind of bring that momentum and also bolster that engagement in a positive and constructive way, I think that will be very, very fruitful. One final word, I know I've gone beyond my 3 minutes, but because public opinion was mentioned, and I appreciate that question because you know, we've talked a lot here about states and the role that states plays in negotiating such documents, but it really is very, very important in terms of what the public and what young people contribute to these processes, how they, what they expect of policymakers in their respective countries and regions. And our office does invest a lot in trying to educate, trying to build capacity of the general public and of young people in particular through our educational programs, through our online learning opportunities for specific capacity building for young people. And I think, you know, this is a very, very important element of ensuring that issues of disarmament, arms control remain central. I agree with everything that's been said that, you know, some of these issues really dropped off the public discourse, I think, for many years, for perhaps more than a generation. And so now is a really important, crucial moment in time where we can change that. And I think that is a collective responsibility of states, of the international organizations, of civil society, and in particular, of course, also of young people who are the change makers in that regard. So I think that's a very positive thing that I also take away from this, in that it's also raised interest. The full room in Vienna this evening, I think, is testament to that. So we think we need to continue to bring these issues, keep them on the agenda, not let this just be a document that's put on the shelf, as you said at the very beginning, Markus, but also continue to have these conversations and contribute to the accountability process. I'll leave it at that, and thanks again. It's really lovely to tune in from New York and have this chance to interact today.
Rebecca, thanks a lot, and then Jaewoo.
Yeah, maybe just briefly, because I think Rebecca covered it very comprehensively already. I think, you know, one of the contributions that I tried to highlight also in my opening remarks is that disarmament is discussed and approached across its many facets. So not just nuclear, but even if you're just interested in the nuclear element of things, you recognize nuclear relevant items throughout the pact. And so how it situates nuclear disarmament within the broader peace and security agenda is quite important, and a contribution for sure. It really it centers it as something that's both necessary at present, but also in the future. Maybe just briefly on your question on challenges to non-proliferation, I think, there for sure are challenges, and they are exacerbated by conventional conflicts we see, because states wonder about their national security and the credibility of the broader regime in assuring that, you know, they are not affected by the potential use of nuclear weapons, right? So it for sure is a challenge, and even more so, it is important that, you know, in the pact and in other contexts and fora, the non-proliferation regime is highlighted as being very important. Here in Vienna, of course, the IAEA is doing the necessary work to provide the international community the assurances on this part of the regime on non-proliferation, but also on peaceful uses of nuclear energy.
Thank you, Markus.
So I would like to respond to the question about how the pact is new and how it's different. I'm not able to speak as to how it differs in terms of the implementation that will follow or the content. What I am, however, able to say is that the involvement of civil society, and especially the involvement of youth in this document, is unlike what has been done before at the United Nations level. So, for example, the Austrian youth delegate programs and Marvin, who unfortunately left, but who was my predecessor as a youth delegate, they held extensive consultations with over 500 people. They went to numerous events, commented on each revision, and some of the comments actually ended up as EU positions on the pact. Youth delegates have had success in actually putting their concrete wordings, their concrete demands that they gather from young people into the pact. So whereas maybe content-wise, other experts will have to talk on the difference, maybe this pact for the future, the Summit of the Future process will kind of shift the conversation in terms of how we arrive at consensus and who we include in developing these projects. So I'm not sure if that is totally satisfactory, but it is at least something, especially for us young people, it means a great deal. On the topic of disinformation, just because it was briefly mentioned, this is also an issue that I just wanted to quickly speak about because it's so important for young people. I have a personal anecdote. When I lived in Senegal, I talked to one of my many nephews there and asked him what he would do if he had a superpower. He's 14 years old. He said he would fly. And the second thing he said is he would help Putin liberate Ukraine. He is from a liberal household, educated parents who are pacifists, but the disinformation campaigns in, for example, West Africa on TikTok, Instagram, etc., target young people and achieve so successfully to convince them of things that are completely disrupted from their reality. So I just wanted to mention that we need also more engagement on the information war because it contributes to security and on the public opinion on many things, disarmament being one of them. And lastly, the question was, is there new momentum? I think other experts, as before, will have to make that judgment whether there is momentum. But what I can say is that if we don't recognize the active role of young people in the implementation, then this momentum will not lead anywhere long term. So we must recognize that young people are so affected and carry so little guilt in security issues, need to be a part of the solution and need to have an active voice. I will end it there.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I think actually that should have been the final words. But maybe just very briefly on the question on what we can do to convince those who try to acquire nuclear weapons not to. I mean, there are agreements. I mean, we had it with Iran, Mr. Soltanier knows that. I mean, there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action where this actually was tried actually to limit Iran's possibilities. But then we also need to understand that agreements are never going to be perfect. So, but I mean, agreements are part of one thing, what we can actually do. There was something, it was actually a good document. It was not perfect because documents never are, neither is this pact, but it's still a step into the right direction. So this is something we can do. And the next thing is really, we need also to talk a little bit more about the dangers of nuclear weapons, what they are also having. I mean, I don't know, like making alliances together maybe with the climate groups, because nuclear weapons have devastating effects on climate and nature issues, so you can find coalitions there. And thank you so much again, Mr. Soltanier, for talking about the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a hard Austrian project, I must say, because Austria has been very, very active in there, but not only Austria, but also especially civil society groups actually working together in bringing this. And it showed something which I think is positive, and that might be my positive note. Sorry for not being too positive altogether. But it is that there is actually a huge majority of population, public opinion, and including states who actually do not want to have nuclear weapons. And if we also consider that there is something like called the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, who said that the world has never been as dangerous as before when it comes to nuclear weapons. And we don't even talk about outright nuclear war, but there can also be accidents, etc. So this is something we also need actually to push a little bit around, and also to make people public and aware again of what actually these weapons are able to destroy. And I think this is something where civil society, experts and diplomats can actually work together. And I do think that also the pact in this sense is truly maybe not very new in many directions, but a recommitment to these things is very important, because it took them 15 years, and that's a very long time considering the world we're living in. But I already made that bad outlook before.
Stephanie, thanks a lot. The question that I always ask myself with these huge documents, that is, on the one hand, it's remarkable that UN member states agree upon something like this. Yeah, so it passed without a single vote cast against it. Yeah. On the other hand, obviously, it's always the question whether states live up to the promises that they make in such an agreement. And it seems to me that it's just not enough to rely on states to simply keep their promises. Yeah? So there is a role for civil society, and there is a role for us actually to remind states to keep those promises. And that's basically, I think, the purpose of this event. So on that note, I'd like to thank Rebecca, perhaps most of all, because she did basically all the heavy lifting in terms of organizing this event. So Rebecca, thanks a lot to New York. And thanks a lot also to Jaewoo, to Markus, to Stephanie, and of course, all of you for your great questions and comments that you made. Have a nice evening.
Yes. Sure.